the chef who cooked through exile. Exile does not always begin with borders. Sometimes it begins with silence, with a sudden realization that the place you belong no longer recognizes you. For one chef, displacement did not end his cooking. It reshaped it into something quieter, heavier, and impossible to separate from survival itself. Before exile, his kitchen was rooted in familiarity. Ingredients arrived with predictable rhythm. Language flowed easily between cooks. The food carried the accent of home without effort. Cooking was not an act of preservation. It was simply life continuing. But when the fracture came, it came swiftly. One decision, one shift in power, and suddenly everything familiar became unsafe. The chef left with little more than memory. No written recipes. No equipment worth carrying. Only the instincts shaped by years of repetition, and the knowledge that food, once removed from place, must learn how to exist again. Exile stripped him of context. What remained was technique without territory, tradition without land. Today, displacement is often spoken about in numbers and policy, but its most intimate effects surface in kitchens. Food is how people remember who they are when language falters. It becomes a way to rebuild identity when names, streets, and histories are no longer accessible. To understand how this chef cooked through exile, we must understand that his food was never meant to represent his homeland. It was meant to carry it. In the first place he landed, the ingredients were wrong. Familiar flavors were missing. Substitutes tasted hollow. Early attempts failed. The dishes resembled memories but lacked their weight. Each plate reminded him not of what he'd lost, but how far away he was from it. Still, he cooked, not for recognition, not for an audience, but because cooking created structure in days that had lost shape. He cooked in borrowed kitchens, in shared spaces, in rooms when no one spoke his language. Slowly, something shifted. The food stopped trying to replicate the past. It began responding to the present. New ingredients entered. Old techniques adapted. The dishes grew quieter, less descriptive, more resilient. What emerged was not nostalgia. It was continuity. And as the chef learned to cook without a homeland beneath his feet, he discovered that exile does not only take things away. Sometimes it forces you to decide what is essential enough to carry forward. That decision would soon be tested by memory, by expectation, and by a world eager to turn his displacement into a story he was not ready to tell. At first, the chef avoided attention. He cooked small meals for people who shared a situation. Others displaced, others learning how to rebuild ordinary days. The food was simple, made from what was available, shaped by necessity rather than ambition. It was never introduced. It was simply placed on the table, eaten and cleared. Those meals carried a strange power. People lingered longer. Conversation slowed. Silence felt less heavy. The food did not explain where it came from, but it allowed people to feel grounded again, even briefly. The chef noticed that when he cooked, the room softened. For a few moments, no one needed to explain who they were or where they had been. Word traveled quietly. Soon, people outside the displaced community began asking about the food. They framed it as discovery, as authenticity, as a rare window into another culture. Invitations followed, pop-ups, collaborations, features. Each request carried the same promise: visibility in exchange for explanation. Tell your story. Share your journey. Translate your pain into something people could consume. The chef declined most of them. He understood the danger. Exile, once framed for others, becomes narrative rather than reality. Suffering becomes context. Resilience becomes branding. The food, once necessary, risks turning symbolic. And symbols invite ownership by those who have never lived inside them. Still, the pressure mounted. One invitation felt impossible to refuse. A respected restaurant offered him a temporary residency. Full creative control. No demands for storytelling. Just a kitchen, resources, and time. The chef accepted cautiously, believing he could let the food speak without explanation. The first services were quiet and respectful. Guests arrived curious but restrained. The food unsettled them, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it refused to comfort. Dishes shifted nightly. Ingredients changed with availability. Nothing was fixed. Some guests praised the restraint. Others asked why the menu lacked clarity. Reviews followed. They admired the food but wanted narrative. They described the cooking as powerful, but incomplete without context. One line appeared repeatedly. "The food feels like exile." The chef read that sentence over and over, unsure how to respond. The food did not feel like exile to him. It felt like survival. The residency drew attention he could no longer avoid. Journalists requested interviews. Panels invited him to speak on displacement. They wanted him to explain how exile shaped his cuisine. The chef felt a familiar tightening in his chest. The world was asking him to perform a loss. He was still living. The conflict sharpened. Could he continue cooking honestly once his food was framed as representation? Could the dishes remain lived experiences instead of translated symbols? As expectations grew, the chef realized the next choice would decide whether cooking remained his anchor or became another border he was forced to cross. And that choice was approaching faster than he expected. The pressure reached its peak during a public event attached to the residency. The room was full of industry figures, writers, and diners who arrived carrying stories they wanted confirmed. The chef felt it immediately, the shift from curiosity to expectation. This was no longer about tasting. It was about interpretation. Before service, an organizer suggested a brief introduction. Just a few words. They said, context would help people understand the food. The chef declined gently. He had learned that once context is given, experience becomes secondary. The dishes arrived as they always had. Quiet, adaptive, shaped by what the day allowed. Some guests leaned in, attentive and open. Others looked unsettled, scanning plates for meaning rather than tasting. A critic asked a server what the dish represented. Another whispered that the menu felt unfinished. Midway through service, a question reached the kitchen. Hashtag left double quotation mark text equals text.replace 94. Which dish is about leaving 94? The chef paused. He realized then that the food had been cornered. It was no longer allowed to exist as nourishment or continuity. It was being asked to stand in for trauma, to translate exile into something legible, consumable, and complete. After service, he addressed the room, not as a statement, but as a boundary. Hashtag left double quotation mark text equals text.replace 94. This food is not about exile. 94, he said calmly. Hashtag left double quotation mark text equals text.replace 94 is about being here. 94. The reaction was divided. Some guests felt relieved, others disappointed. Articles the next day reflected that split. Some praised the refusal to narrate pain. Others accused the chef of withholding insight, of missing an opportunity to educate. The residency's support began to thin. Invitations slowed. Advisors suggested leaning into the story while attention lasted. The chef felt exhaustion settle in. Cooking had once been a refuge. Now it was becoming another place where explanation was demanded. That night he cooked alone. He prepared a dish that reminded him of nothing specific. No memory, no reference, just something sustaining, balanced, present. As he ate, he understood something with painful clarity. Exile had already taken enough. It would not take his food too. The next decision would be final. Either he would allow the world to define his cooking through the lens of loss, or he would step away from the spaces that required explanation in exchange for visibility. The climax of this story was near, and it would decide whether the chef's food remained a living act of survival or became another narrative shaped by those who never had to leave. The chef ended the residency without announcement. No farewell service. No closing statement. He simply returned the keys and stepped away from the kitchen that had begun to ask more than he could give. To the industry, it looked like disappearance. To him, it felt like preservation. He returned to cooking the way he had begun in exile, quietly, privately, for people who needed to eat, not interpret. The food changed constantly, shaped by availability, mood, and necessity. No menus were printed. No stories were offered. The dishes were not explained because they were not symbols. They were sustenance. Over time, something unexpected happened. Those who ate his food stopped asking where it came from. They asked how it made them feel. They noticed that it did not point backward or forward. It anchored them in the present. The chef understood then that Exile had not defined his cooking. It had clarified it. He was no longer trying to recreate home or explain loss. He was building continuity without geography. The food carried discipline, restraint, and care, but belonged fully to where it was cooked. Exile had not erased his identity. It had stripped it down to what could survive anywhere. Years later, his influence surfaced quietly. Other chefs stopped naming pain in their menus. They trusted the plate to hold complexity without translation. They allowed food to exist without narrative scaffolding. The industry did not credit him. It didn't need to. The shift was already underway. The chef never returned to public platforms. He understood that some truths weaken when repeated too often. His cooking remained a private language, shared only with those willing to meet it without expectation. Exile had tried to turn his life into a story. He refused. Instead, he cooked his way through it, one meal at a time, until survival became something quieter, steadier, and deeply his own. So, what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? The chef